Hello everyone, and welcome back to Appalachian Fear Files. Today I am bringing you 6 chilling tales of true Appalachian hunter horror that will haunt you long after the credits roll. It was late October when I first stepped into the ridge on a hunt that was supposed to clear my head and refill my lungs with cold pine air. But the wind brought something else that day, a smell metallic and sour like old coins and wet cloth. These accounts come from seasoned hunters, paramedics, rangers, and volunteer searchers who went out into remote hollows and never found the same world they left. Each story has been reconstructed from eyewitness testimony, official reports, photographs, and field notes. Certain names and precise locations have been changed to protect identities and safety. Stay with me until the end. These are not campfire tales. These are investigations that left tangible traces and altered lives. My name is Harper Reed, and I grew up on the edge of a coal hollow in eastern Tennessee. Hunting and backwoods navigation were taught to me as rights. My first stand was a handmade platform nailed into a white oak by my grandfather. The valley we hunted is thin country, long ridges and steep hollows where cell service dies at the trailhead and the compass can feel like charity. On the third morning of that season, before the sun had fully opened, I hiked a ridge I had walked since childhood and found a line of metal stakes driven into the earth around a small clearing. The stakes had bits of cloth and rusted shells tied to them and a scrap of paper pinned to one with a knife point. The paper had a list of names that included one I had heard in family stories and one I had never heard before. I stood there holding my rifle and felt the cold press into my bones like a hand. 20 minutes later, I heard a set of footsteps on the ridge behind me that stopped dead as if someone had reached an invisible wall. I did not wait to find out what that silence meant. I climbed down the way I had come and ran until my lungs burned. This is where the first story begins. My first story comes from a man named Cole Matthews, who was 33 when he took his customary October hunt into a portion of the ridge locals called Black Range. His backstory is longer than most because hunting saved him once and then turned into the place he could not escape. Cole grew up the son of a coal miner and learned the smell of diesel and wet earth before he learned to swim. At 17, he left for the Army, where he served 2 tours as a medic. The things he saw in war mornings and in crowded emergency rooms made the silence of the woods a balm. After his service, he moved home to care for his mother and took up hunting as a way to keep doing something precise with his hands. He kept a Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to his grandfather, a leather blind, and a small Chevy truck with a dented bumper and a cooler full of sandwiches. Hunting for Cole was ritual and math, a set of predictable variables that he could control when nothing else in his life made sense. He was known in the county as reliable, soft-spoken, and good at tracking. People asked him for help finding dogs, lost hikers, snapped branches, and the occasional stolen toolbox. He was the kind of man who carried extra water for strangers and set trail cameras for neighbors. After an accident at work that put his mother in the hospital, Cole depended on the woods more than ever. The deep backstory matters because the thing he found on the edge of a hollow shifted everything he had used to organize grief. It was not a single event. It was a charcoal map of small choices that led to a place where names became ornaments and a hollow became a courtroom for something unnameable. Cole set up on the second ridge above an old logging road before dawn. The air was tight and bright, the kind of blue you get when the night has bled out its moisture. He had banded his boots with duct tape because of a sore spot from a long walk the week before. He had his rifle, a thermos, and a handheld GPS model that had saved him more than once. He described the morning in precise sensory fragments. He smelled smoke that was not the wood smoke of a permitted campfire. It was acrid and old, as if it had been wet and kept smoldering in the roots. He saw a circle of burned grass a few dozen yards off the trail, the center black and bare. There were 9 stakes driven into the ground at irregular intervals, each one with a different object tied, a bootlace, a fragment of a shirt button, a brass bullet casing, a small rusted key. One stake had a scrap of paper. The handwriting was cramped and tilted, and in the corner there was a date. Cole said he made the classic mistake of moving closer to read it and felt the air change like the inversion of a weather front. On the scrap were 3 names, one scratched out and the others crossed with a stroke that made them almost illegible. He felt watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by the geometry of a circle that refused to be incidental. He backed away, then heard a voice calling his name from the valley below. The first dialogue exchange is long and precise because in the valley the conversation mattered as evidence. Cole called back with his name, and the sound of his voice carried thin. A woman answered, asking if he was okay. Sarah identified herself later as Sarah Bell, a volunteer who walked those hollows collecting firewood for elderly neighbors. Sarah said she had been following a small buck and stumbled on the burned circle 2 hours before Cole. They exchanged rusted pleasantries that do not belong in transcripts but matter in memory. Cole said, "I found these stakes," and she said, "I saw a scrap pinned to one." And he said, "Did you read the names?" And she said, "I thought it was a list, but it looked like a map." She told him to wait, and she climbed up the ridge with the sort of breathless, practical curiosity that marks someone who has lived with the woods all their life. When they stood together, the paper that had been pinned to the stake fluttered in the breeze like a moth. Their dialogue continued. Cole asked, "Should we call Sheriff Green?" And Sarah said, "We could, but last time they were slow." And Cole said, "Maybe Ranger Mills will come faster." And she said, "My phone has no bars." The exchange is long because it establishes choices, and then, crucially, because a third presence interrupted. From the tree line, a man came out with mud up his calves and a smile that did not meet his eyes. His clothing was mismatched, like he had been wearing other people's jackets for warmth. He walked unnaturally quiet for a man carrying a length of rebar. Dialogue between Cole and the stranger stretched until it filled the hollow. Cole said, "Who are you?" And the man said, "Name is Hank." And Cole asked, "What are you doing out here?" And Hank said, "Watching." And Sarah asked, "Watching what?" And Hank only smiled and said, "Names." Cole asked where he had come from, and Hank said, "Down the hollow." And Sarah asked if he saw anyone else. And Hank looked into the circle and said, "Sometimes they return." The exchange included smaller noises, the scrape of fabric, a boot sucking at mud, a crow calling like a question. The conversation became evidence of intent because Hank reached and pulled a knife out and began to scratch another name onto the inner bark of a sapling with an awkward urgency. Cole stepped between him and the tree. Hank's voice lowered, and he said, "You do not belong here." And Cole said, "This land belongs to the people who hunt it." And Hank laughed in a high, thin way that made Sarah flinch. At that moment, a vehicle was heard in the distance, a truck coming down the logging road. Hank wiped his hands on his coat and slipped back into the tree line. The truck turned out to be Sheriff Green on patrol. The arrival of Sheriff Green expanded the scene into official memory with procedural language that later mattered in court of public opinion. The sheriff walked the circle with gloved hands, examined the stakes, took photographs, and asked everyone to sign a recorded statement. Sheriff Green said, "You both stayed put, keep your distance," and he wore a well-reheated patience that only rural officers cultivate because they answer the same calls again and again. He told them he would call in Ranger Mills and the county search and rescue. Officer Ramirez arrived as part of a county response with a portable radio that hissed with static. Coleman recited the names he had found to the sheriff. Among the names was one that matched an obituary from 50 years earlier and one that matched a name recently missing from a neighboring town. The duality of time in that list created a cognitive friction, a past that had not been contained and a present that was bleeding into it. For the rest of that day, they combed the hollow and found more oddities. A set of footprints that circled the burned patch and then vanished. Footprints that had no heel drag, as if the person had walked on the balls of their feet. They found a small metal tin with a Polaroid inside. The photo was overexposed at the edges, but in the middle there was a blurry arrangement of objects on a cloth. A lighter was visible, a pocket knife, and if you stared hard, you thought you could make out faces to the left. All items were catalogued. Ranger Mills took custody under written chain of custody forms. The technical description of evidence intake would later become important. A brief procedural note for listeners who care about the technicalities. Standard chain of custody requires an item to be photographed, logged with who collected it, where it was collected, the time, and the environmental conditions noted. The evidence bag must be sealed with tamper indication and transported to a secure facility where a receipt is issued. In this case, Ranger Mills logged the tin, labeled it with time and GPS coordinates, photographed it from multiple angles, and placed it in a sealed evidence envelope. He then drove it to the county forensic lab where Dr. Harper processed the photograph for latent images. The description above is a simplified sequence but captures the essentials that later allowed investigators to tie the tin to other items found on adjacent ridges. Night fell and the woods thickened. Coleman, who had a habit of walking his dog Milo along the logging road, did not return home by midnight and his phone went straight to voicemail. Around 2 in the morning, the sheriff received a call from a neighbor reporting headlights on a closed service road. They found Cole's truck facing away from the hollow, keys in the ignition, door ajar. Milo was not with the truck. The next scene is a prolonged moment of tension and fear. Search teams spread out with flashlights, thermal imaging when available, and canine units. Volunteers Tom, Linda, and Miguel combed the lower hollows with lanterns. In one long, stretched paragraph that holds 500 to 600 characters, the narrative of that night intensifies. The sound of breath held, the repetitive sweep of torches, the smell of copper when the wind shifted, and the memory of the burned circle. A call came in at 3 a.m. from a volunteer named Ben who had found a blood smudge on a tree about half a mile from where Cole had been. They followed a trail of broken branches and at dawn found Milo curled inside a shallow depression with his collar torn. There were scrape marks on the ground and a ring of disturbed needles. No human tracks led directly away. The sheriff declared an active missing person case. The community reaction was immediate. A Facebook group organized search rotations, local hunters donated supplies, and the county asked for outside assistance. A volunteer named Claire organized a ledger of donations, and another named Hank, not the same Hank from the Ridge, led the volunteer teams. The sheriff warned against entering the area in groups smaller than the assigned teams. Over the next 2 weeks, the search turned up small, disquieting clues. A journal page was found tucked under a stone on a nearby ridge with handwriting that matched the scrap in the burned circle. The page contained a list of coordinates and a line that read, "Do not trust the returning." The handwriting analysis later compared samples from the tin and the journal and found inconclusive matches. The sheriff called in the state police for cadaver dog support. The field forensics team explained the limits of what they could do in dense leaf litter and steep inclines. A technical aside. Searches in heavily wooded terrain often fail to locate remains because exposure to animals, weather, and soil acidity can break down organic material faster than expected. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect specific volatile organic compounds associated with decomposition, but their effectiveness can be limited by wind, moisture, and time since deposition. The team kept careful logs. Weeks became months, and the case cooled into a cold file for investigators who had more pressing leads. Cole was never found. Weeks after the initial incident, an online forum of local historians uncovered that decades earlier, a series of disappearances along that same ridge had been recorded in sheriff archives. The names on Cole's scrap did match a few of those older entries, and one of the names was a child from a long-ago mining camp who had vanished with his family. The overlap between times implied a repetition. At community meetings, the older hunters whispered about a trespasser or a drifter who moved through ridges like a bad weather pattern. Others proposed less credible theories. The ambiguity remained the most frightening part. Cole's mother sold the family land and moved away. Milo lived with a neighbor and would not let anyone be alone on the tailgate of a truck at dusk. Sheriff Green told reporters they had no smoking gun, but then rangers, Increased night patrols, and the shape of the hollow changed for the people who passed through it. I have not been back to Black Range since that season. The questions remain. The second narrative involves a woman named Zoe Alvarez, a paramedic who found an old cabin off-map and a journal whose last entry ended with the words, "The compass has stopped." Zoe's backstory is necessary because she entered that forest with a precise toolkit of trauma management. Zoe was 31 and had been a paramedic for 9 years. She had a reputation for steady hands and an impulsive curiosity that made her a good person to have at a scene. She began hiking to decompress after late shifts and chose trails with water, ideally streams with a bed of smooth stones. She kept a compact compass, a map printed on polymer paper, an old but functional Nikon camera, and a small moleskin notebook where she jotted odd details to keep from carrying them in memory. Her family moved to the region when she was a child, and she knew the names of small creeks that did not appear on GPS. On the afternoon she found the cabin, she was following an unnamed rocky creek called Little Run, known to locals as a place that drained a forgotten watershed. She arrived at the creek when the sun was low and found an old path that dipped into a thicket. The path ended at a cabin whose roof had been patched with tin and whose porch sagged but was otherwise intact. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was dry with an underlying smell like old paper and backstove smoke. On the table was a leather-bound journal open to a spread filled with dates and small sketches. Zoe took photographs and flipped pages. For 3 days the entries were mundane, lists of what had been hunted and times of rain. Then the hand changed. The entries became shorter and claws of ink marked the edges. The final entry read, "They have taken the compass." The next line was mutilated, as if the writer had been interrupted. Zoe closed the journal and put it in her pack. The cabin scene comes with several long dialogues because Zoe reached out to locals and the way people described the cabin later mattered a great deal. She talked to a neighbor named Austin who had grown up near the creek. She called him and asked, "Have you ever seen that cabin?" And he answered, "Not that one, the one further down." And Zoe said, "The journal suggests someone living there recently." And he said, "A lot of people used to live there, but not anymore." And Zoe asked, "Did people just leave?" And Austin said, "Things happen when minds close." Austin drove up with his brother Lyle the next morning, and they both walked the property with Zoe. Austin's voice on the recording is casual but tight, and Lyle laughed once. He found a rusted harmonica on the porch and then stopped because the laugh sounded wrong inside the cabin. They debated calling the sheriff and decided to let Ranger Mills know because the cabin might be on county land. The ranger came, took photographs, and later told Zoe that the cabin was built on a private deed whose ownership was ambiguous in county records. The journal's surety complicated matters because ownership would mean who had the right to live or leave. As the story unfolded, Zoe experienced a pocket of disorientation. She described how her compass behaved. She was exact in her language because she had a paramedic's precision. The compass did not spin smoothly. The needle jerked and then aligned with a direction that felt wrong to her body. She walked out of the trees and found herself on a slope she did not recognize. The light had the wrong ratio for time of day. As she later told the county reporter, it felt like a part of the world had been folded. The camera photos showed an overexposure along the edges, a bloom that made the trees look like they had been painted with milk. Zoe called her station chief, Karen, and told her everything. Karen listened and then suggested they take the journal to Dr. Harper, a forensic linguist, to analyze the handwriting and see if it matched other entries found in the region. When Dr. Harper examined the journal, he noted that the ink had been made from different batches and that certain entries had been written with a shaky hand consistent with someone who had been in physical distress. Dr. Harper took samples back to the lab for chromatography to determine ink composition. This technical process of ink analysis takes several steps: solvent extraction, separation via thin layer chromatography, comparison against known ink samples, and a chemical signature map. The results in this case showed at least 2 distinct ink sources and some traces of iron oxide, consistent with exposure to ground disturbed by rusted metal. The journal was cataloged and copies were made for the sheriff.
The county reported that no one in their database had reported living there recently. A search was mounted for the original author. Over 2 weeks, they interviewed elderly residents, including Marjorie, a woman who had a memory of a man living in a cabin in the 1970s who used to carve small wooden animals. She named him Eli Carter and said he used to say the woods would give you back what you lost. When detectives looked for records on Eli Carter, they found a vague mention in a courthouse ledger of a transient who had been questioned years earlier and then vanished in a different mountain range. The pattern of returning names continued. Zoe kept the journal copies in a drawer at home for a while and then started to dream of a pocket of heat in the trees and a voice that called maps wrong.
Stopped hiking alone. The journal remains an open puzzle. The third account belongs to a hunter named Mason Hill, who found a circle of stones arranged around bones near a service trail. Mason had a backstory of generational hunting and a skill set that made his observation particularly reliable. Mason was 45, had a squat frame, and he carried old habits like a tow in the truck. His family had farmed and hunted in the area for 3 generations. He knew tree scars like other people know their kin. He also had a strain of skepticism bred by decades in the woods. He was not one for the supernatural. His experience of a ritual circle forced him to reassess that stance. He found the stones on an overcast morning while scouting for a doe. The stones were arranged in a tight ring roughly 2 meters across. Inside the ring there were fragments of animal bone and what looked like feathers, charred. Someone had placed small offerings on the stones like coins and a wristwatch. A pocket knife was buried nearby. Mason called Ranger Mills and the sheriff. The evidence was photographed and logged. A local college anthropology professor, Dr. Lillian Carver, visited and said the arrangement bore similarity to certain outsider ritual marks, but could not be definitively linked to a culture. The ring had a smell Mason described as a mix of iron and sage. The presence of human bone would later be confirmed by a county medical examiner. The discovery prompted a larger search and social unease. Dialogue between Mason and the sheriff revealed the exactness of his observations. Mason said, "They were placed carefully," and Sheriff Green replied, "You mean like someone intended us to see them?" And Mason said, "Like an offering." And the sheriff said, "Who would be leaving offerings up here?" And Mason said, "People that want to be seen or people that want to mark territory." The line between ritual and claim grew fuzzy. Across the next narratives, I will present 6 more episodes because the title promises 6 chilling tales, but the ridge keeps returning like a punctuation. Each tale is separate, yet threaded by the same atmosphere of remote Appalachia, the same sense that the land holds patterns that people cannot always decode. The 4th story is about a couple, Jade and Liam, who were followed at dusk down a logging road and found silent figures around their campsite. Jade grew up camping with her father and had an intimacy with night sounds. Liam was a wildlife photographer who had a habit of staying up late to capture owl shots. They pitched their tent near a small pond. At 2 a.m., Liam woke and heard soft steps crunching the frost outside the tent. He whispered to Jade and unzipped a slit to peer out. At first, all he saw was the reflection of moon on the water. Then, a line of small lights like lanterns moved along the tree line with a
rhythm that made no sound. Jade and Liam described the figures as too orderly, walking with heads down. Liam took a photo through the mesh, and later the image showed little more than an irregular blur. But in some frames, there were elongated shadows that did not match the lamppost or trees nearby. The next morning, they found stones placed around the tent and a small pile of cigarette butts and seeds. When they told the ranger, he advised caution. The exchange with Ranger Mills included language about trespassers and rituals and about whether groups came through as a social activity or with intent. The 5th story centers on a man named Evan Park who found an old Polaroid on a logging path that connected his family to a string of missing people. Evan was a genealogist by trade and hobby, skilled at tying small artifacts to broader histories. He had been tracing the family name when he found a Polaroid half buried under moss. The Polaroid showed the backyard of a house that had been torn down in a flood years ago, but also a list of names scrawled in ink in the margin. Among them was Evan's great-aunt. The discovery sparked a cold case review. Evan worked with Officer Ramirez and Dr. Harper to cross-reference names with old reports. The Polaroid had minute chemical traces that suggested it had been developed in a certain kind of camera cluster common in the 1980s. Evan's dialogue with detectives was long and detailed. He provided family records and camp inventories. Over months, they discovered a pattern of small exchanges of objects left at particular markers along a ridge that formed a network of what locals called places of exchange, where people would leave tokens to honor the lost or to send messages across time. The sixth story belongs to a volunteer searcher named Bella James, who found a small skeleton in a cave entrance and a ledger that recorded dates like appointments. Bella was a part-time EMT and a volunteer who mapped caves in the area. Her discovery had immediate forensic weight because skeletal remains carry data. Bella described the cave entrance as narrow and smelling of old peat. Inside, on a ledge, she found a small heap of bones covered in a cloth. Beside them lay a thin notebook with entries that annotated names and dates that matched missing persons files. Dr. Harper and the medical examiner performed an osteological assessment. The bones were fragmentary, but enough to suggest adult human remains. The notebook had material that could be traced to certain local print shops. The medical examiner performed a radiocarbon calibration and then a partial DNA extraction. The DNA procedure involved careful sample collection under sterile conditions, securing the sample chain of custody, extraction of nucleic acids, quantification, amplification of mitochondrial markers, and comparison against known databases. The process can fail if samples are degraded or contaminated. In Bella's case, partial profiles matched a lineage
from a family who had filed a missing person report years prior. The community responded with vigils, and the sheriff reopened old missing persons cases. The ledger's dates formed an unnerving calendar. The seventh account involves an older hunter named Otto Green who left a voice message found on a public answering machine describing figures moving at the edge of his field. Otto was a retired lineman who had long memories and a small collection of war stories. One fall morning, his neighbor found his truck with the engine running and Otto absent. His phone had recorded a 10-minute monologue of him describing seeing silhouettes at the edge of his property that walked without making noise. In that monologue, Otto described a sound like fabric rubbing fabric and the smell of pennies. The recording ended mid-sentence. Officers searched and found only disturbingly arranged items around his tree line. The investigative detail noted that the arrangement of socks, a spoon, and a child's toy formed a triangular pattern repeated in other locations. The repetition suggested a pattern or a language of placement. The eighth tale is about Adrian Cole, a hunter who found a set of footprints that headed into the fog and returned without maker. Adrian had been hunting with two friends when they encountered a sudden bank of fog that rolled across the ridge like ocean. They followed the footprints out of habit and found that the prints looped back on themselves, stepping into the fog and then appearing 30 feet away with no connection. When they compared shoe treads with those prints later, they did not align. Their discussion with experts at the university revealed the possibility of an overlay phenomenon where ground subsidence and moisture can distort impressions. But volunteers who had walked the prints said the mud had been disturbed in a careful way. The argument between scientific possibility and local testimony widened. The ninth story brings us to Lillian and Cameron, siblings who were on a late-season deer run and found a shallow grave near an old trailhead. Lillian, who works in the county library, recognized a shoe from a missing persons photo book. They called the sheriff and the site became the focus of an excavation.
The bones suggested a person had been buried within the last 5 to 10 years. The siblings recounted the excavation with detail, from the tools used by the search and rescue to the dust settling under the sun. Dr. Harper took samples for isotope analysis to determine diet and geographic origin. Isotope testing in such cases gives an idea of where someone lived based on ratios found in teeth and bone that reflect local water and food signatures. The analysis in this case suggested the person had spent much of their life within a 100-mile radius, tying the burial to local communities. Around 1/3 into these narratives, I want to pause and address you directly, because this community is our greatest resource. If
these stories have made you uneasy, you are not alone. Many of you have written in about strange nights on trails, about compasses that wobble, and about footprints that do not make sense. Tell us in the comments what your most unsettling outdoor experience has been. Start your reply with the phrase, "in the woods," so we can group similar reports. Sharing helps others understand which areas to avoid and can reveal patterns that authorities may not see. Your recollection may be a piece that helps a family find answers. Now, back to the cases. Returning to the details, each case involved overlapping characters and recurrent names in evidence. Sheriff Green, Ranger Mills, Dr. Harper, Officer Ramirez, Sergeant Nolan, Volunteer Tom, Volunteer Linda, Volunteer Miguel, Claire the organizer, Marjorie the elder, Austin the neighbor, Lyle his brother, Ben the tracker, and Bella the cave mapper all appear across narratives, sometimes as helpers, sometimes as witnesses. Their actions and testimonies stitch the stories together. Investigations varied in intensity. Some led to forensic breakthroughs, others stalled on insufficient evidence. Patterns emerged. Lists of names were found carved into bark, scratched into tin, and jotted into journals. Photographs were either overexposed or contained unclear figures. Bones turned up in shallow caches. People reported a metallic smell, the feeling of initial drowsiness, and the same phrase whispered in different accounts, sometimes as a cadence rather than words. The antagonists in these narratives are ambiguous. In one case, there was a transient known locally as Big Reed, who had a reputation for living off-grid and had scars that made people uneasy. Big Reed's backstory contained criminal records for petty theft and several altercations, but no convictions for violent crimes. He had been seen around several of the ridges prior to many of the incidents, and at times provided help moving a stuck truck. When questioned, he gave unstable answers and sometimes offered strange platitudes. His backstory, compiled from interviews and police records, painted a man 25 to 30 years old, raised in a caravan culture, with an inconsistent work history and medical notes suggesting untreated head trauma. He disappeared from view after being questioned and has not been located. The complexity is that Big Reed could be a human who took advantage of isolation or a scapegoat for deeper phenomena. Each story contains moments where procedure met the unknown. In the Mason Ring and Bella Cave cases, official investigators took soil samples. Soil sampling included layered collection, noting horizon changes, preserving context, storing in sterile containers, and returning samples to labs for pollen and mineral analysis. Those tests sometimes revealed non-local pollen grains, suggesting objects or people had been transported from other valleys. In the Bella case, DNA extraction was partial and failed to produce a complete match. The limitations of field forensics in forest terrain were repeated across cases. Rangers emphasized the need for time-stamped photographs and witness statements and cautioned volunteers to avoid contamination. The technical detail is repeated because it is the mechanism by which a story moves from rumor to record. Dialogues punctuate the later scenes as communities tried to decide what to do. At a meeting at the county hall, Pastor Williams stood up and asked what could be done. Marjorie pressed her hands together and said, "This ridge has always been mean in the dark," and Claire suggested a neighborhood watch. Officer Ramirez advised patience and to treat evidence carefully. The arguments were long, sometimes reaching the tens of exchanges that show how communities process threat. Those meetings, recorded on the public record, show a mixture of fear and pragmatic planning.
People who had hunted all their lives admitted they no longer went alone. Others sold property. The county instituted a temporary ban on nighttime camping in several preserves and increased ranger patrols for a season. Months later, some threads resolved and others unraveled. The epilogue traces consequences in 3 moments. 1 month after the first incident, there was an increase in patrols and a short press release that promised pursuit of leads. Ranger Mills confirmed that cameras installed in high ridges recorded nothing human-shaped after dusk. The community organized a rotating patrol, and volunteers like Tom and Linda kept logs and coordinates. 3 months later, an anonymous tip led investigators to a shallow pit on a private tract. They excavated and found materials that were associated with one of the names on a journal. A partial DNA match suggested a familial link. The county reopened the missing persons file associated with that name. The discovery prompted renewed media interest and donations for more thorough forensic study. People who had been skeptical began to talk about what they had seen in ways that sought patterns rather than solitary horror. 6 months from the first night, the sheriff reported that while there had been no arrests, the pattern of discoveries had led to a collaboration with a university lab. They had arranged for long-term camera traps, more rigorous soil analysis, and isotope tests on recovered remains. Community workshops on trail safety were held, and a memorial was placed at a trailhead with names recovered and a request for information. Despite the institutional action, many families felt the system had not given them closure. Some hunters sold equipment. Others held to their traditions but refused to go into certain hollows. The tension between vigilance and resignation settled like a secondary fog. The psychological impact on narrators was severe and sustained. Cole's friends told reporters he had become jumpy, sold his rifle, and left the county. Zoe refused to hike alone and took on extra shifts to avoid being idle. Mason stopped calling certain trails by their old names. Bella became more careful in cave entries and joined an advocacy group to standardize gruel evidence collection. Across the narratives, insomnia, sudden cold sweats, and avoidance behaviors were common. People reported the sensation of being followed by sound or of a smell returning in memory when they least expected. These are not incidental details. They become part of the record of harm. Each story leaves certain elements open. In some cases, the evidence was solid enough to show that human agency was responsible. In other cases, the phenomena resist straightforward human explanation. The rituals could be localized criminal acts, a network of drifters using the woods for a dark economy, or they could be performances whose meaning was lost. The idea that the land itself resisted being read is a theme returned to by multiple participants. People would say the forest did not want to be known, or that the pattern had a grammar they could not decode. For researchers and for families, the practical route forward was to gather more data. Volunteer searchers were trained in basic evidence preservation. Rangers pushed for better coordination with state labs, and the county applied for grants to install permanent monitoring devices. I will leave you with the closing emotional recapitulation. These events changed people in ways that were not reversible. Some sold land, some formed patrols, and some refused to accept that the missing were gone. Investigations yielded partial identifications and a handful of artifacts that were traced to local families, but no single explanation satisfied the pattern. The sheriff increased patrols, the county funded camera traps, and certain pieces of evidence entered state databases. The community reaction was a mixture of vigilance and fear. A small memorial now stands at the trailhead near Black Range, with names carved into a weathered plank. I know that the ridge keeps its own time, and that memory is an imperfect means to force it. If you have an experience to add, please write "in the woods," followed by your brief account. It helps others and it helps us find patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. If you want to see updates on any of the cases mentioned, subscribe and check the pinned notes where we list sources and follow-ups. My final lines return to the person who told me the first story. I know those ridges intimately enough that memory of the smell of cobber and the sight of stakes driven into the soil is etched into the part of me that remembers being safe. I sold an old blind and a rifle, and I do not sit in tree stands the way I used to. The investigations continue in fits and starts. Some documents were traced, a few names were connected to long-missing registries, and 2 graves were located with remains that matched partial DNA profiles of people once reported missing. The county still has open inquiries. The community still patrols. And on clear nights, when the wind moves across the ridges, the hollow seems to hold a patience that is not restful. Take care, be deliberate on trails you do not know. Go with others when the night is near. And if you find a list of names carved into bark, do not touch it. Report, photograph from
distance, and call your local authorities. The forest will keep its secrets unless we keep careful records. And I will leave you with one sentence to hold as you walk. The woods will sometimes give you what you are least prepared to carry.